Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation. Anshe Emet, joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Anshe Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School of Long Island. It's great to see you guys. We're recording this on day 685 of the captivity of the hostages. We note that date, 685, um, praying as always for their release. We hope that that comes soon, as well as the anguish of all those who wait for them and the suffering of all the people that are around that. We are mindful of that as we begin thinking about this parsha. We're recording it a week before because many of us are away during the week of Shoftim, and we want our many, many listeners and viewers to have the benefit of a parsha talk, even though we are going to be away next week. Shoftim is our parsha. I just want to pitch out the idea that Shoftim functions as a kind of constitution, a mini constitution, because it deals with different modalities of authority. I know, Barry, maybe you want to just outline the taxonomy for us of the different kinds of authorities that are listed here.
So there are four authority figures that are discussed here: prophets, priests, kings, and judges. And each represents its own model for authority and for bringing God's will and word into the world.
So, would you include Shoftim? Did you say Shoftim in there? Or
Yeah, I thought I did. So
okay,
judges, kings, priests,
judges,
and
kings,
prophets.
prophets. Okay, um, and I mean it's not a constitution in the sense that we have the United States Constitution or constitutions of other countries that really specify checks and balances and other kinds of things. Although the text lends itself to the interpretation of all these different areas have different realms of power. We could think of the judiciary, and it's are these co-equal parts of government, so to speak. The monarchy, the judiciary, and the prophet. They function in different ways. I mean, I guess if you like, you could say that you know biblical Israel presents a view of the world in which these three different kinds of people are all relating to each other in with authority. Um, and the prophet's role is really to speak truth to power, I guess, power to the king. The king.
Well, I think it assumes that there's something deficient in the other forms of leadership. That's why
Uh-huh.
you need a prophet, right? The authority, we sometimes forget that the authority for both the priest and the king and even the judge is from God, right? They're not against God per se. They're ordained by God to a specific task. And one of the things that's noteworthy, I suppose, about our Parsha is that the Parsha speaks of the problems that could come up with these kinds of leaders.
So let's
And yeah, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
let's talk about how authority is vested in these individuals, and specifically, the king. And I'm focusing on the king only because with the king we have the word bachar, that God chooses the king, and that this is the individual that God chooses. The verse is I lost the verse where we got the king. King is
1714.
1714. Okay. So it says here, when you get into the land and you dwell in it, Asim alai melech, I'm going to place upon me a melech, asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo, that God is going to choose. And so in a sense we have a paradox here. You want to The king is divinely ordained, and yet the king also the has to have public acceptance.
Well, there's two different.
Yeah.
I mean, these verses right here in chapter 17, verses 14 and 15, uh, give two different answers to this question. Okay, ki tavo el haaretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach v'shtav yishavta ba. You're going to come into the land, and you say to yourself, and ve'amarta, and you say, asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher sevivotai. We really need a king. There's a king of there's a pharaoh in Egypt, and there's kings in the various places around us, and so the people are the initiators here in the story. And then it says, asher yibchar Adonai elecha bo, with the one whom God chooses. This is the same thing. That's the pattern is repeated in Shmuel in the election of Shaul, which is that the people come to Samuel and say, "Listen, your sons are crappy leaders. They're corrupt. They're not good. The Shmuel leadership is going to come to an end. We want a king." And Shmuel really is unhappy. And God says to Shmuel, "Don't worry. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me." The desire for the king to be like the other nations, God describes in Shmuel as a rejection of God. And then Shmuel reads them the riot act and tells them the king is going to be abusive in almost the exact same ways that Devarim will warn about. And but then God picks Shaul because Shaul is tall and handsome and talented and gifted and all those good things. And so it is at one and the same time, the Bible here in this passage in 17 and in Shmuel, and then some of the sources about David are of course, David is a hero, and he's also a very complicated character. The Bible has tremendous ambivalence about kingly leadership.
So,
So to speak to
but
that ambivalence, Tigay has a note on verse 15 that the appointment of a king is optional, and the monarchy is the only office so characterized. And then the next verse, his comment is that God's will, meaning God's choice for king, must be communicated by a prophet, which happens for Saul and David and Jeroboam. And, one of the curiosities about the figure of Shaul, we think is much maligned, perhaps unfairly, is that he combines elements of the prophet and the king, because his first experience that we see him is he's prophesying with a band of prophets, and only later will he become the king.
it is
Yeah, that
fascinating.
Tiki note I think is we're talking about the JPS Bible commentary edited by Professor Jeff Tigay in the Devarim edition, the Devarim volume. Um, if I'm not mistaken, I think classical rabbinics um, reads both, encodes both ideas. Some people say that it is reshut, but there's also a view that it's obligatory. Som tasim alecha melech. When you get into the land, you are, like it says, if I'm not mistaken, it says 3 mitzvot are commanded when they enter the land. Defeat Amalek and appoint a king and something probably temple related. See if I
Build
can
the temple.
something. I got to find that one.
If we may just for a second veer into the political philosophy that the Torah seems to be um, kind of expressing here, which is that we understand that there is a need for authority. We understand that there's a need for leadership. There is a tremendous ambivalence to placing all of this leadership within the king. So on the one hand, it says that the king must be chosen. The king is chosen by God, and yet there is the assumption in the cases that we mentioned, certainly at the beginning of the monarchy, Saul is chosen by God, but clearly Saul is a very, very fragile, flawed figure, and God. I mean, in the way that Samuel the prophet expresses it, God kind of regrets having chosen Saul. We would use the term manic depressive about Saul. That he does have these manic episodes and depressive episodes, and for all sorts of reasons, he's a deeply flawed king. David, as you mentioned, is a heroic figure, and David, by his very name, is also the beloved figure, the one that seems to have the the most complicated but also beautiful, rich relationship with God. David is a warrior, a murderer, a poet, a political genius.
He's a
Um,
lover and a fighter.
he's a lover and a fighter, and he he has the
and a singer of songs.
remarkable ability to gather the tribes around him in this shared idea. And so there's no reason, why he would not be beloved by the people and beloved by God.
There is. I
Okay,
have to
interject here.
interject here. And the reason is that David embodies all the flaws of the monarchy in his family. Because the key to the Davidic monarchy, unlike Saul, there was a kind of expectation that Saul's sons would rule in his stead. But that was defeated by the civil war, often glossed over when we study the book of Shmuel. But David is promised the monarchy as a hereditary monarchy. And yet his own family is so rife with discord that even though Solomon is going to emerge as a great king, it's not clear that any of David's sons originally are fit for the role. And there is this tension that will play itself out through the entire First Temple period, where there's a kind of point and counterpoint between the good king and the bad king, because the Davidic family just is not what we would consider to be a model family for leadership.
Right, and I mean,
David is David is there's everything you said is quite correct, and it's part of David's charisma. David is uh, his because of the stories of Amnon and Tamar and Avshalom, famous story. It's a little unclear too in the story how what the incest norms were of their age, because Amnon wants to marry his half sister Tamar. She says to him, "Well, just like work it out with dad," and he'll say, "Okay." But they're half siblings. But in any event, when he doesn't get his way, he has his way with her, and her full brother Avshalom then kills him, and then there's a civil war between, and Avshalom rebels against David, and one of the major stories in the book of Second Shmuel, and he almost wins, but he doesn't finally win. And when he is killed, it is, in my opinion, the most moving, heartbreaking scene of the Tanakh. David weeping over the son he has had to defeat in battle. Avshalom, Avshalom, Beni, Avshalom, Absalom, Absalom, my son, would that I had died instead of you. And he's one of the greatnesses of that scene is the passionate parental love that David says. Akidekak, to such an extent that his general Yoav says, all these soldiers here risked their lives for you, and you're making a mockery of them because you're mourning over your enemy. That's how war goes. He's your enemy. But David just loves
yeah.
so much as a parent. It's just a spectacular scene.
No, it's and then look, Solomon, who takes over from David, and we could argue about how that transfer of power happens. It's not godly. That the way that the monarchy goes from David to Solomon,
Well, it's a
even
scene right out
though
of The Godfather.
it's exactly a scene right out of The Godfather. I mean, it's Nathan the prophet, and Bathsheba, the queen mother, basically the queen, who orchestrates her son Solomon to be the king. And so then, you read this in light of Deuteronomy and say, well, where is God's choice here? How is God choosing Solomon? And one more thing, which is, Solomon, who is a wise king and is a great king and builds the temple and all of that. And we know that by the end of his career, it's very questionable as to how righteous and wise he is. Notwithstanding that, at the beginning of his career, it's almost a scene out of The Godfather because he knocks off a lot of his opponents at the beginning.
Yeah, he does. He does.
Exactly. And
But just with this, so our many listeners perhaps have not uh, reviewed that when in that mitzvah and back in Deuteronomy 17, when God either commands the selection of a king or at least acquiesces to the selection of a king, says, listen, here's what you got to do. The king cannot have massive horses because he's just going to care only about his livery, and he's going to send the people back to Egypt to get more horses. And he cannot have many wives because that's just always going to be a temptation for kings because they'll lead his heart astray. And he's got to, when sits on the throne, he's got to himself write a Sefer Torah and carry it with him to remind himself to follow it. And he can't be arrogant and he can't be haughty because all of those things are what happens inevitably with kings. And they are exactly what happens with Solomon. So when Solomon gets that job, uh, David says to him, "Okay, listen, you have to keep the Torah Moshe. If you keep the Torah Moshe and you keep lalecha bidrachav lishmor chukotav mitzvotav umishpatav ve'edotav, you keep all the laws and the rules and all the statutes. Leman taskil et kol asher ta'aseh, and you'll be enlightened or successful in whatever you do, and then you'll be okay. You'll be a good king. But then I will now read you the first line of chapter 3. Vayitchaten Shlomo et Paro, melech Mitzrayim. And Solomon married into the house of Pharaoh in Egypt, and he took Pharaoh's daughter to be his wife. Okay, the very thing that Deuteronomy knew was going to happen. I knew this was going to happen. He's going to have too many wives. He's going to go back to Egypt to enrich himself. First chapter.
And what does Pharaoh's daughter do?
Huh?
Pharaoh's daughter, doesn't she bring in one of her idols into the temple?
They do, right? And later on, chapter 8 or 9 in First Kings, it says Velohaya libo lohaya shalem. His heart was not whole.
I remember a good sermon about
I remember
that.
a good sermon on that. So the point is though that I guess from a scholarly point of view, is the author of Kings sitting with the book of Deuteronomy in front of him, or is Deuteronomy sitting with the book of Kings in front of him? And there seems to be a relationship between these two books, in the sense that Solomon, as you mentioned, violates almost all the norms that are listed in Deuteronomy. But let's go back to this whole notion of choice, because it intrigues me. I'm studying this idea of choice in the book of Deuteronomy. The bachar as a verb occurs something like 32 times in Deuteronomy, and in this case, it's God chooses the king, but we have choice elsewhere, and I'll pitch to you a couple of places that God. I have found 7 instances where there's choice. But of the big ones are the king, the Kohanim, are also chosen. The Jewish people, anachronistically speaking, the people of Israel, they are chosen. They're chosen as descendants. Bechar bizar am. I loved your ancestors. I loved your fathers, so I chose their descendants, and I chose you. You're holy. I chose you. And of course, the place that God chooses, Hamakom asher yivchar, the place that God chooses, it's a result of a divine choice. That's in Parshat Re'eh many times, which is last week's Parsha, for the people that are watching it this week of the Shoftim week. How does choice, when you choose something, you're choosing against something. To be referred to as the chosen people, I think, has been a source of great privilege and great pride to us, but also a great responsibility and perhaps the source of many people's hatred for us. Discuss.
We have a small number of strategies. We were talking before we started recording, and Barry, proposed one, and you can elaborate, which it's one that I think modern liberal people have to agree, have to follow. I do think that the ancient world was much more comfortable with not a total superiority kind of view, but a pride of place. Maybe it's more responsibilities. Maybe it's greater intimacy. What did it say earlier in Deuteronomy? What nation has God so close to them as us? And I just can't, it can't really be part of my own personal, in that kind of exclusivist or hierarchical way, um, even a greater amount of responsibility or something like that, that just can't be part of my spirituality and Judaism. It has caused too much wreckage. So I'm going to prefer the view that Barry will elaborate. But I tend, in just general casual conversation with congregants or whatever, I tend to prefer the phrase "the choosing people" rather than the chosen people. Like I think that we should be, you know, we should be people committed to our path. More, we choose it more than it chooses us. And there's this pasuk, ki Yaakov bachar lo ya. It's in Psalms somewhere. Yaakov bachar lo ya. And in classical Hebrew, the subject is often the last word of a phrase, as it is the simple semantic meaning of that phrase. For Jacob has the Lord chosen, but I just prefer to kind of creatively misread it and go Yaakov bachar lo ya. The
So,
people of
you're
Jacob have chosen.
uncomfortable, and I think we're all, we're all uncomfortable, maybe, to a certain extent, on varying degrees, with the sense of chauvinism. That choice represents chauvinism, and that every human being has to kind of, you know, deal with the fact that, you know, I think I deal with the fact that I'm just not. I'm just not Michael Jordan. I'm just not an athlete. I'm just not. I have certain skills. I
You're
can
much better at Talmud than Michael
I'm
Jordan.
much better than that. I just can't throw a ball in a basket. Okay. I'm not Tiger Woods. I can't shoot a ball into a hole. I can, there are things that I have talent at and things I don't have. And these people who are exceptional have been chosen in their various fields to lead their various fields, to be exemplars in whatever. And so I can have two postures, which is I can admire those people who have superior talent to me and superior ability, or I can envy them. And if I admire them, I can say, I'll never be like you, but I'm also myself. I'm happy being myself. I'm happy having no talent in basketball. I'm happy, not being able to know how to even play golf, let alone put the ball in to hit a ball. I'm happy, and I admire you. And that stance of admiration and awe, I think, is part of it. We just don't feel comfortable saying this is, we have a very specific kind of relationship with God. Everyone is entitled to that relationship, and you too can join the people of Israel and have that relationship. And it's not that you're not chosen in your own way. It's not that you're not exceptional in your own way. It's just that what defines us as a people is that we have a very complicated relationship with God, and admire that, envy that, love us or hate us for that, or somewhere in between. And how do you respond to that line of thinking in that way?
Well, Barry, you should go now.
Okay, thank you. As I struggle for the word. So I think the model that I like to use is a parent with many children. So from the parent's point of view, the parents love each of their children. The child should feel loved, but should not feel that his or her siblings are not loved as well, both in addition to, but also qualitatively as well. And I was remarking that I think it would be fair to say that in my family, my siblings and I each thought we were the favorite child for a good part of our lives. And I think that's a successful parent because parents have to love their children and children need to be loved. And I think it's the same with God. And what I would suggest is that the model of chosenness when it pertains to God is that a relationship with God cannot be neutral. There has to be some intimacy and there has to be some passion. And that is expressed in the word bachar, bechira, and choosing, because that's how we identify the non-neutral part of our relationship with God. It doesn't mean that we're better than anyone else. It just means that we are unique. And I was struck by your comparison with Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods. You can only admire them because they actually realize their chosenness. If Michael Jordan had never played basketball, we would not have known that he was a great basketball player. And I think it's incumbent on each of us to identify our gifts, attribute some of them perhaps to God, and live our lives accordingly so that we can be admired. And I think that, you know, thinking about it because you drew a connection with anti-Semitism, that perhaps part of the problem is that people who look at the Jews as being better than others or attribute to the Jews being better are actually projecting themselves. It's because they cannot find something to admire, so they tend to denigrate. Everyone should.
I love the fact that you brought up those two transcendent athletes. By the way, each of whom um, was also famously morally flawed or had their own, had their own shortcomings, but each of whom is also fanatical hard workers. And the perhaps the relationship and the excellence that they embody is, and this is applies in very obvious ways to both chosen people and chosen kings and chosen prophets, is that part of it comes, from God and is an unearned grace, but that's just step one. And there may have been any number of players. I mean, like, just again to a basketball example, these are great, great, great players. Kobe Bryant was like Michael Jordan. He was a fanatical competitor and fanatical hard worker. And Shaquille O'Neal was a great player, was having a good time. And they didn't get along because Kobe Bryant could not relate to the fact that Shaquille O'Neal wouldn't stay in shape and he wouldn't, he didn't spend nearly as much time working on the game. And so, like, to really be, and you lovely phrase, to make yourself admirable, like, okay, you have gifts, and maybe that's the part of this relationship that comes from heaven, but you have to craft yourself, in the great Abraham Joshua Heschel phrase, but live your life as though it were a work of art. You have to craft yourself into someone worthy of that gift, and that other people will recognize the gift upon you in your way of life.
So, what I would add to your point, Jeremy, is that perhaps with the idea of chosenness, we have to recognize that chosenness is the beginning, not the end of the journey. That we should have this feeling of being chosen, no matter who we are, and that should dictate the way that we live our lives.
What I want to just kind of amplify from what you're saying, Jeremy, and Barry also is there seems to be implied in chosenness a tremendous amount of humility. That is to say, I'm not worthy of this, or what the chosenness means is I have just so much responsibility, and Jews, because we are human beings that have a tendency to lazy thinking, like all human beings end up misinterpreting chosenness as in a chauvinistic way and say, it just means that we have this exceptionality, therefore, it's because and it does get expressed in some wild places. A lot of there are a lot of Hasidic works that have this kind of amplification of a supremacy and other, and we see it
Oh,
playing itself out in politics in very ugly ways. But I like what you
it's
said
very,
also
very,
in terms of the hard work and all that. Just wanted to amplify that. Go ahead.
very, very important, that last point you just made. First of all, this has roots in medieval Kabbalah, but as you alluded to, Elliot, and I'll just cite it up, that um, it reaches its very full expression in the Tanya, the major book of the founder of the Chabad school, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and it's a mystical masterpiece. There is so much in it that is so beautiful, and he also believes that Jews have a human soul and non-Jews have what he calls nefesh behemit. They have an animal soul, and, like,
Yeah.
it's just revolting. And you said it comes up in difficult ways. I mean, here we are in this long, long, long war, and one hears certain kinds of statements from uh, Jewish people who, I'm just ashamed, take a very racist and vicious attitude towards our adversaries. The Palestinians are not easy neighbors. We have had a long, bloody conflict with them, and they are not subhuman. And it is the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that accompanies a discourse of chosenness, can so easily slide into a supremacy that we really have to vigorously reject.
It is such a responsibility to hold on to this relationship and understand, what its parameters are, and to say, of course there's uniqueness here. Of course there's a certain sense of connectedness here, but it comes with such immense responsibility. I mean, to fight a just war justly, as people like Daniel Hartman have been saying endlessly on his podcast, and that responsibility that we place upon ourselves, um, in our own self-perception, that we need, this is for our own sake, we need to do this. Um, I'm struck by it only because choosing is so important. With this, I just want to conclude, which is that there's actually one more place that choosing, the verb occurs, and that's right at the end of Dvarim. And we've quoted this many times. It's uvacharta v'chayim, choosing life. And it seems to me that all of these things are lined up, that God choosing the people, God choosing a place, God choosing Kohanim, God choosing a king, God choosing the ancestors, and our obligation to choose life. That this is somehow linked. That the act of choosing is the ultimate expression of human freedom, and that the same way that God chooses a place for the temple, the Makom Asher Yivchar, the place that God chooses, we are choosing life. I'm just wondering if you could help me kind of not, to connect all the dots here. Is there a connection between choosing life and being chosen, or God choosing? Is there any?
I like what Barry said earlier in the parent-child model. I mean, we live blessedly, even though the Bible goes back to a polygamous society or polygynous society, not that women could have multiple spouses, but men could have multiple wives. Yes, that's true, but we don't live that society. We live in a monogamous society, which I think is much better. And love can mean um, an exclusive relationship like two spouses, or it can mean a more, a wider ranging thing like a parent with multiple children. One can only imagine, each of our kids when their second child was born, they were still very small toddlers, and they probably don't even remember a time before that. But it's hard on a child when a parent comes home and says, "Oh, I love you just as much, but now I've got somebody else," and in a way that we would presumably not, outside of fundamentalist Mormons, not relate well if somebody comes back and says, "Oh, I love you just as much, but I have a new spouse too." That wouldn't go down. But livchor, to choose, I think is very often helpfully translated as love. And so, v'charta b'chayim, to me, I think it is. I colloquially often translate that as love life,
Life.
and the relationship of God to Abraham is a we talked about this before we started recording, is a kind of affirming joyful love. The spousal relationship is an affirming joyful love. The parental relationship, and perhaps also the prophets. It's like, God wants to say, Yeshayahu, let's talk. Moshe, let's talk. I want to connect with you.
I'm looking for the exact textual parallelism of Bachar and Ahav. That the choice is both, I guess, semantically parallel, synonym for love, and I think
Well,
that's where we're going here.
so you had the wedding that you
Yes,
celebrated
got it right.
recently, and we referred to the beloved as Bechirat Libo,
Yeah,
the chosen of the heart, and the symbol of that is Ahava, is
exactly.
love. So I
Yeah.
think that's the connection that you're looking for. And what I would add here is that I think that religion fundamentally is about free will, and that's why choice and chosenness is so important. It's because things are not necessarily dictated to us. We accept them and we choose them and we submit to them.
Yeah. And that is that. That brings us to the end of our talk. as we submit to the clock here. But again, this has been fascinating as always. And thank you, viewers, listeners. We so appreciate your time with us. I get these texts and messages from people watching, and they say how really important this is to them. So we're honored and humbled that you have chosen us as to be your source for Torah knowledge. We're humbled by that you've chosen us. In the meantime, we want to wish everyone a good Shabbat
Shabbat Shalom.
Shoftim, Elul, and we'll see you next week on the next edition of Parsha Talk. Shabbat Shalom. Bye bye.